What if the apocalypse was never meant to signal the destruction of the world, but the destruction of a lie? For centuries, we have been told to tremble at visions of fire raining from the heavens, trumpets of doom splitting the sky, beasts rising from the sea to devour the earth. Paintings, sermons, and rituals have branded apocalypse as terror, the ultimate punishment, the final end. But the word itself means something far more forbidden: unveiling. Revelation, the tearing away of veils that hide the truth. Imagine the fear that could be maintained by recasting unveiling as annihilation, to keep humanity chained. The church and empire did not need swords alone. They needed stories. They needed you to believe that when the veil lifts, what emerges is only chaos and judgment. But what if the veil hides not wrath, but freedom? What if the apocalypse was never about the world ending, but about empires ending, lies collapsing, systems of control being exposed? The book of Revelation itself pulses with double meaning. The beast may be less monster than empire. Babylon, less a city of sin than a symbol of Rome. Trumpets and seals, less cosmic destruction than coded ritual. A whispered message to the oppressed. The rulers you fear are temporary. The system you obey is already falling. Apocalypse as awakening, not doom. And so the forbidden question rises. Have we been taught to fear the very thing meant to liberate us? If to see the architecture of evil in the story of apocalypse, you must first ask, who benefits from fear? For centuries, the word apocalypse has been painted with fire and ash, screams and trumpets, beasts and destruction. But this imagery was not accidental. It was carefully cultivated, built into sermons, etched into cathedrals, carved into consciousness, until the very thought of unveiling became synonymous with annihilation. The system's brilliance was to reframe Revelation as terror, so that truth itself was feared. The roots of this architecture stretch back to the Roman Empire. The book of Revelation was written in a time when Christians lived under persecution, veiling their messages in symbols so Rome would not recognize its own condemnation. Babylon was not a mystical city, but Rome itself. The beast was not a supernatural monster, but an emperor who demanded worship. The coded apocalypse was not the end of the world, but the unveiling of empire's corruption. It was resistance disguised as prophecy, rebellion hidden in vision. Yet in later centuries, that resistance was stripped of its context, reframed as cosmic disaster. The empire that once feared apocalypse absorbed it, repackaged it, and used it to terrify its own people. The church became the steward of this inverted vision. By teaching that apocalypse meant fiery destruction at the hands of God, it created a theology of fear that placed humanity in permanent debt. Every generation was told, the end is near, the judgment is coming, your only hope is obedience. This kept populations docile, desperate for absolution, chained to sacraments. The unveiling of empire's lies was buried under layers of dread, until even the thought of questioning was equated with courting doom. This architecture of evil is visible in the way apocalypse has been ritualized. Preachers thunder about judgment, paintings depict horsemen riding across burning skies, hymns wail of fire and brimstone. Each repetition builds the architecture higher, brick by brick. Instead of preparing souls for awakening, the rituals prepare them for fear. Instead of exposing empire, apocalypse is recast as divine empire, eternal and unchallengeable. Humanity lives not in anticipation of freedom, but in terror of fire. Consider how useful this has been to rulers. People believe the world itself is doomed. They will not rise against tyranny. They will wait for God to do it. If people believe unveiling means punishment, they will not seek truth. They will cling to authority for protection. Fear of the end becomes a leash, leading humanity not toward liberation, but toward obedience. Apocalypse, once a coded vision of rebellion, is domesticated into a threat that secures control. This system thrives on inversion. What was meant as hope is branded as terror. What was meant to unmask empire is twisted into judgment on humanity. Revelation was written to comfort the oppressed with the promise that their oppressors would fall. But the church retold it as a warning that the oppressed themselves would be destroyed unless they complied. The architecture of evil rests on this reversal, a fortress built from stolen symbols. And the architecture does not stop at theology, it seeps into politics and culture. Governments have long wielded the specter of apocalypse to consolidate power. Evil rulers invoked the Last Judgment to suppress rebellion. Modern states evoke nuclear apocalypse, climate apocalypse, technological apocalypse. Fear of the end paralyzes resistance, convinces populations to surrender freedoms, to accept surveillance, to obey decrees. The architecture is adaptive, wearing new masks in every era, but always serving the same purpose: to keep humanity small, waiting, afraid. Yet beneath this construction, the original meaning of apocalypse remains. In Greek is unveiling, revelation, the tearing away of masks. The first readers of Revelation did not tremble at the end of the world, they longed for the end of empire's lies. They read of Babylon's fall and knew Rome's corruption was not eternal, saw the beast unmasked and recognized their emperor's tyranny. Apocalypse was not doom, it was hope coated in fire. The architecture of evil has hidden this truth for centuries, but cracks show through. Every time a sermon warns of fire, yet the world continues, doubt grows. Every time a prophecy fails, the veil thins. And in those moments, the forbidden possibility emerges. Maybe the end we have been taught to fear is not ours at all. Maybe it is the end of the system itself. This is the true architecture of evil. To convince you to fear the very liberation you need, to dread the collapse of the chains that bind you. By turning Revelation into apocalypse, the system ensures its survival. But when you awaken, when you see through the inversion, the architecture begins to crumble. And once it crumbles, the unveiling begins. Symbols are the grammar of apocalypse. They do not speak in plain sentences. They burn, roar, and echo in images that bypass reason to strike at the marrow of the soul. When Revelation describes beasts with many heads, trumpets that split the heavens, bowls of wrath poured across the earth. These are not journalistic reports of disaster, they are symbolic codes, messages wrapped in vision, hidden in fire. To awaken, you must learn to read their language. The beast is the most infamous. Preachers thunder of a monstrous entity rising to devour the faithful, stamping the mark of 666 upon their flesh. Fear lingers in every repetition. But in the symbolic language of the first century, the beast was not a literal creature, it was empire. The 7 heads represented 7 hills, a direct cipher for Rome itself, the city of 7 hills. The mark of the beast was not a mystical barcode, but a demand for loyalty, the worship of Caesar as divine. To resist was to risk death. See the beast as symbol is to unveil empire, not tremble before fantasy. Babylon, too, is a symbol. Draped in purple and scarlet, drunk on the blood of the saints, Babylon in Revelation is no mystical city of the future, is Rome, coded to avoid censorship. The prophets of old used the same language. It's calling every corrupt power Babylon. It is the archetype of empire, the eternal symbol of decadence and oppression. Yet the church, in its architecture of fear, recoded Babylon into an otherworldly city of sin, pushing the symbol outward into the future so that no one would recognize the empire of the present. The unveiling was buried beneath delay. The 4 horsemen gallop across imagination: conquest, war, famine, death. Taken literally, they terrify. Taken symbolically, they describe the cycle of empire itself. Every kingdom rises with conquest, bleeds in war, starves in famine, and falls into death. It is not the world that ends, but systems. The horsemen are the eternal cycle of history, the unveiling of how power devours itself. To read them as prophecy of global doom is to miss their forbidden truth. They are mirrors of every empire, including our own. The trumpets and seals are rituals in sound and symbol. Each blast does not foretell random disaster, but signals unveiling. Trumpets in Hebrew tradition announce judgment against corrupt rulers. Seals guarded messages until the appointed time. In Revelation, each trumpet and seal peels back another layer of illusion, revealing what lies beneath empire's glittering facade. The world does not collapse, the mask does. And then there is the number 666, perhaps the most infamous symbol of all. Countless theories swirl: microchips, barcodes, secret cults. But in its original language, 666 was a code of gematria, a way of turning letters into numbers. Written on parchment, it spelled not demon but Emperor Nero Caesar. The mark was not prophecy of a future tyrant, but unveiling of the one who already ruled. The symbol unmasked empire in real time, coded to slip past censors. To turn it into superstition is to erase its power. Even the imagery of fire and blood is symbolic. Fire is not always destruction. It is purification, illumination, the burning away of lies. Blood is not merely death. It is witness, testimony, the price of truth in an empire that kills rebels. Revelation is not a horror show, but a ritual unveiling, each symbol tearing away another layer of illusion. Yet over centuries, these symbols were inverted. The beast became a fantasy monster instead of a cipher for empire. Babylon became a mystical city of sin instead of the Rome outside the reader's door. The horsemen became omens of doom instead of mirrors of history. 666 became superstition instead of protest. The unveiling was silenced by fear. The language of symbols meant to awaken was weaponized to terrify. But symbols resist domestication. Even today, when you hear the word Babylon, you sense not only a city, but a system. When you see 4 horsemen, you feel not only doom, but the cycle of history. When you read of trumpets and seals, you imagine not only destruction, but revelation. The symbols still whisper their original meaning, forbidden though it may be. Apocalypse is unveiling, not annihilation. The forbidden truth of symbols is this: they are alive. They speak differently, depending on who listens. To the fearful, they scream of destruction. To the awakened, they sing of liberation. The same fire that terrifies the obedient illuminates the rebel. The same blood that frightens the guilty testifies to the innocent. Symbols are not chains, they're keys, waiting to be turned. To reclaim the language of symbols is to reclaim apocalypse itself. To see beasts as empire, Babylon as system, horsemen as history, trumpets as unveiling, fire as illumination, is to dissolve fear and ignite vision. The apocalypse ceases to be doom. It becomes revelation. The veil lifts, the system trembles, and humanity stands not at the edge of annihilation, but at the dawn of awakening. Blood has always been the oldest currency sacrificed on altars, spilled on battlefields, used to seal oaths and contracts. In the imagery of apocalypse, blood flows like rivers, staining seas, filling bowls of wrath. To read this literally is to drown in fear. But to read it symbolically is to recognize the hidden economy at the heart of empire. The exchange of life for power, the endless demand for sacrifice to sustain the system. Revelation does not invent this image, it exposes it. The book of Revelation is saturated with blood. The martyrs cry out from beneath the altar, their blood demanding justice. Armies clash until blood rises to the horse's bridle. The Lamb himself is described as slain from the foundation of the world, a paradoxical figure, both victim and victor. Bloodied yet enthroned. This is no accident. Blood in apocalyptic vision is both indictment and currency, a mirror of empire's greed and a testimony against it. For Rome, blood was the foundation of order. Crucifixions lined the roads as public warnings. Gladiatorial games spilled blood for entertainment, normalizing violence as ritual. Taxes funded endless wars, and every conquest demanded new sacrifice. Empire stability was purchased in blood, the blood of rebels, slaves, the conquered. When Revelation speaks of a whore drunk on the blood of saints, it is describing Rome's economy of terror. Blood was its wine, its coin, its intoxication. But the church, inheriting this imagery, transformed it. The blood that once indicted empire became central to salvation. Jesus' blood, spilled in defiance of Rome and priesthood, was reframed as the ultimate payment. The rebel's death was transformed into cosmic transaction, original sin as debt, crucifixion as settlement. Apocalypse, once unveiling empire's hunger for blood, became reinforcement of blood economy itself. Rituals like Eucharist perpetuate this economy, drinking wine as blood, reenacting payment, binding humanity to the idea that only blood can save. Yet in Revelation's symbolic logic, blood is also witness. The martyr's cry is not payment, but protests their lives testify against empire's cruelty. Their blood unveils the system, showing the true cost of power. The slain lamb is not coined for debt, but paradoxical resistance, the victim who unmasks empire by refusing to yield. Blood here is not sacred because it pays, but because it reveals. It testifies, it indicts, it unveils the machinery of oppression. Still, Empire prefers the transactional reading. If blood is payment, then obedience is assured. If salvation requires sacrifice, then fear secures loyalty. The architecture of evil thrives on this inversion. Rebellion reframed as debt, death reframed as necessity, blood reframed as coin. The Church absorbed Empire's logic, baptized it, and made it eternal. Humanity was taught that life is a debt to be repaid in blood, that freedom is purchased only by sacrifice, mediated through ritual. But Apocalypse whispers another truth. Blood does not buy freedom, it exposes chains. The rivers of blood in Revelation are not threats against humanity. They are mirrors of Empire's violence, revelations of how systems consume life to sustain themselves. The Lamb's blood does not sanctify submission, it unveils the cruelty of power. The martyr's blood is not price but prophecy, declaring that no empire drenched in blood can stand forever. To awaken to this truth is to step out of the blood economy. It is to refuse the logic that suffering is sacred, that sacrifice is inevitable, that obedience is purchased in life and death. It is to see that the Apocalypse was written not to terrify, but to unveil, to show how systems of power always consume blood and how their collapse is inevitable. The rivers of blood are not humanity's doom, they are Empire's exposure. And this is why the system fears Apocalypse as awakening. If humanity realizes that blood is testimony, not coin, the economy collapses. If people see that the crucifixion was Empire's execution of a rebel, not God's transaction, the architecture trembles. If believers recognize that every ritual of blood is a performance of debt, not liberation, obedience dissolves. Apocalypse is not doomed, its revelation that the blood economy itself is a lie. In every age, rulers have tried to control this image. They warn of blood as punishment, but they do not admit whose blood is really spilled. The poor in wars, the oppressed in prisons, the rebels on crosses. Apocalypse unmasks them. It shows the true price of empire. Rivers of blood demanded to sustain illusions, and it promises their collapse, not ours. Blood has always been the oldest currency, but in the Apocalypse, it is not the currency of salvation, it is the receipt of empire's crimes. To see this is to awaken. To awaken is to step out of fear. To step out of fear is to see the end of the blood economy not as your doom, but as their unveiling. Every empire survives on the illusion of a pact. The agreement may not be written in ink, but it is spoken in fear. Obey, and you will be safe. Resist, and you will be destroyed. The doctrine of Apocalypse, as reshaped by the Church, became the ultimate contract. It framed history as a courtroom, humanity as debtors, and God as judge, whose final decree was annihilation. This contract has been whispered into minds for centuries, so deeply that most never think to question it. At its heart, the pact is simple. You are told that the world will end in fire and judgment. You are told that your only chance to survive is submission, repentance, obedience, loyalty to the institution that claims to mediate God's wrath. This transforms Apocalypse from revelation into transaction. The unveiling becomes a deadline. The kingdom becomes a contract. The believer enters into a bargain. Surrender autonomy now, and you may escape destruction later. It is the same pattern that has bound humanity since Eden, the same invisible agreement built on fear. Rituals enforce this pact. Baptism is the initiation clause, marking you as one who belongs to the covenant. Communion is the periodic renewal, a ritual reminder that you are bound to blood and body. Confession is the amendment clause, correcting breaches when you stray. And sermons about the end times are the fine print, warning of penalties if you attempt to break the agreement. Each act is a resigning, a renewal of terms. The contract never expires. It renews through repetition. But contracts require legitimacy, and here lies the system's genius. The original texts of Revelation were not contracts at all. They were coded messages of resistance, visions meant to encourage oppressed communities. Apocalypse in Greek means unveiling, not judgment. The original intent was not to bind humanity under fear, but to reveal the corruption of empire. Yet over centuries, the church reframed the unveiling as destruction. The beast became not Rome, but some future terror. Babylon became not empire, but humanity's own sin. In this inversion, the courtroom shifted. Humanity became the accused, and only the church could negotiate the terms. The contract was fraudulent, but fear made it binding. The pact also thrives in culture beyond religion. Governments evoke apocalyptic contracts to control populations. Fear of nuclear apocalypse, climate apocalypse, technological apocalypse will become leverage for obedience. Do as we command, and perhaps the end will be delayed. Corporations echo the same language in contracts you never sign, terms of service that strip autonomy, agreements hidden in fine print. The logic is identical. You are bound without consent, punished if you resist, dependent on the system for survival. Apocalypse is simply the archetype, the oldest and most terrifying version of the unchosen pact. To awaken is to realize that you never signed this contract. The terms of apocalypse obedience in exchange for safety were drafted by priests and emperors, not by God. The book of Revelation itself contains no such clause. Its visions were unveiling, not agreement. But the church built centuries of theology upon the fraudulent pact, so that entire civilizations lived in fear of breaking rules that were never divine. This is why awakening is so dangerous. It nullifies the contract. Once you see the terms were forged, the obligation dissolves. The rebel voice of apocalypse is clear when the veil lifts. The contract was never between God and humanity, it was between empire and obedience. The system wrote the clauses. The system threatened destruction. System offered salvation only through compliance. But Revelation shows the fraud. The beast is empire. Babylon is oppression. 666 is a ruler's name. The contract was always about them, not you. This raises a forbidden possibility. What if apocalypse was never a contract of doom, but a call to break contracts altogether? What if its visions are not threats, but invitations to see empire exposed and refuse its terms? The seals and trumpets are not penalties, but ruptures, tearing up the parchment of lies. The horsemen are not punishments, but revelations of what empires do when they demand loyalty. Conquest. War, famine, death. To awaken is to refuse the pact, to see the unveiling not as the end of the world, but as the end of their contract. The church's fear is simple. If humanity sees apocalypse as liberation instead of judgment, the system collapses. Sacraments lose their necessity. Obedience loses its grip. Fear no longer binds. The fraudulent pact dissolves in the light of unveiling, and the architecture of evil trembles. The apocalypse does not demand your signature. It tears the contract apart. It unveils the hidden clauses, the false terms, the empire's fine print. It shows you the truth. You were never debtor, never defendant, never bound to their courtroom. The pact was always theirs, never yours. The forbidden truth is this. Apocalypse is not the final judgment. It is the final breach of contract. Every empire endures not simply by force, but by inversion, by taking what is meant to liberate and recasting it as a curse, by renaming truth as heresy and fear as faith. Nowhere is this inversion more complete than in the story of apocalypse. The very word that once meant unveiling, revelation, the tearing away of illusions, has been rewritten into a synonym for annihilation. The inverted moral code transformed awakening into doom, and in doing so, it taught humanity to dread its own liberation. Consider the first readers of Revelation. They did not hear thunderous trumpets as threats against themselves. They heard coded reassurance that Rome's brutality would not last. The beast was their oppressor, Babylon, their empire. To them, apocalypse meant hope that the veil would be lifted, the empire's corruption would be exposed, that the oppressed would see justice. But centuries later, the code was flipped. No longer was the beast an empire. It became a demon yet to come. No longer was Babylon a symbol of oppression. It became a mystical city of sin into which humanity itself was cast. No longer was apocalypse hope. It was terror. The unveiling meant their destruction, not their freedom. This is the essence of the inverted moral code. To place guilt where once there was promise. To reframe exposure of empire as punishment of the people. Apocalypse was not written to condemn humanity, but to unmask the system. Yet in the inverted telling, it condemns humanity and sanctifies the system. The oppressed, who should have seen apocalypse as their vindication, were convinced to fear it as their doom. The oppressors, who should have trembled at unveiling, used it instead as weapon. Inversion runs deeper. In Revelation, the martyr's blood cries out as witness against empire. But in the inverted code, their suffering is reframed as transaction proof that obedience, not rebellion, is holy. The horsemen meant to unveil the cycle of empire's violence are reinterpreted as God's punishments, as though conquest, war, famine, and death were divinely decreed rather than the inevitable outcome of imperial greed. Even the Lamb, slain in paradox, becomes not a symbol of protest but of submission, his blood reframed as payment instead of testimony. The inverted code turns symbols into shackles. Fire, meant to illuminate and purify, becomes fire of damnation. Trumpets, meant to announce judgment against empire, become omens of terror against humanity. The number 666, meant to cipher unmasking Nero, becomes superstition designed to keep people hunting phantoms rather than recognizing tyranny in their own age. The apocalypse that unveiled the world is inverted into apocalypse that blinds it. And the inversion did not remain in theology. It seeped into every corner of culture. Preachers thundered that the end was near, so people feared the sky rather than the empire above them. Artists painted hellscapes, so believers trembled at demons rather than corrupt rulers. The word apocalypse itself became shorthand for collapse, horror, catastrophe. The forbidden meaning revelation was erased. Humanity was trained to fear the very act of awakening, to see truth itself as a threat. This moral inversion is powerful because it seems natural. Who would dare to question sermons that warn of eternal fire? Would stand against centuries of ritual that repeat the same visions of doom? The code hides itself in plain sight. To question is heresy, to doubt is rebellion, to resist is to invite the end. In this logic, obedience is the only path to survival. Fear ensures silence. Silence ensures power. But awakening flips the code back. To see apocalypse as unveiling rather than annihilation is to reclaim its forbidden meaning. The beast is not a phantom, but empire itself. Babylon is not a mystical city, but the eternal symbol of corruption. The horsemen are not punishments, but revelations of what systems do when they demand blood. Fire is not damnation, but illumination. The apocalypse does not condemn humanity, exposes the system that enslaves it. The danger of the inverted code is that it teaches humanity to love its chains. The hope of awakening is that once the inversion is revealed, the chains dissolve. To read Revelation not as fear, but as unveiling, is to see that the end we were taught to dread is not the end of the world, but the end of empire's lie. The apocalypse is not our death sentence, is their exposure. The system survives by inversion. Awakening begins when you refuse it. Rituals are the engine that keep fear alive. They're not only candles and chants and cathedrals, but the repeated gestures, stories, and images that condition humanity to associate apocalypse with terror rather than revelation. By transforming unveiling into doom, the system has ensured that every generation reenacts its own imprisonment. To see apocalypse as end rather than awakening is not the result of one sermonette, is the result of endless ritual. Consider the ritual of preaching. For centuries, fiery sermons have thundered from pulpits, warning of the Last Judgment, the lake of fire, the terror of horsemen unleashed. These sermons are not random. They are performances, rituals of fear repeated week after week. The words sink into imagination until apocalypse is no longer revelation but nightmare. The preacher becomes less messenger than ritual actor, restaging the drama of dread until it feels eternal. Art itself has become ritual. Medieval frescoes depict skies torn open, angels with trumpets, demons dragging the damned into fire. Stained glass windows shine with crimson horsemen, beasts with many heads, Babylon ablaze. These are not merely decorations, but visual liturgies. Every glance reinforces the association. Apocalypse equals terror. Cathedrals themselves became ritual spaces of apocalypse, their soaring arches evoking judgment, their shadows whispering doom. Even language functions ritually. To say apocalypse today is to mean catastrophe, collapse, the end of all things. This linguistic shift is not accidental. It is the fruit of ritual repetition. Newspapers declare economic apocalypse, political apocalypse, climate apocalypse. Each headline is a secular sermon, renewing the same association. Apocalypse equals destruction. The original meaning mailing, remains buried beneath layers of ritualized misuse. Rituals of fear extend into popular culture. Films show cities burning, asteroids colliding, zombies swarming. Music swells with lyrics of end times. Entire genres rehearse apocalypse as doom, training audiences to fear collapse rather than to anticipate revelation. Each viewing is a modern ritual, performed in darkened theaters or glowing screens, reaffirming the inversion. Even secular imaginations perform the liturgy of fear, and within religious practice, apocalypse saturates ritual calendars. Advent is framed as preparation not only for birth, but for judgment. Lent repeats visions of wrath and purging fire. Holy Week climaxes with crucifixion reinterpreted as transaction for the end. Each season is another rehearsal, embedding apocalypse into the rhythm of life, binding it to fear. Yet ritual has always been doubled. The same structures that imprison can liberate when meanings are reclaimed. The Book of Revelation itself is structured as ritual, cycles of 7 seals. Trumpets, bowls-like layers peeled back, unveiling hidden truths. These are not punishments but ritual unveilings, each act tearing away a veil. To read them as doom is to submit to the inverted ritual. To read them as unveiling is to awaken. This is why forbidden traditions like Gnostic communities crafted their own rituals of apocalypse. For them, revelation was not cosmic fire, but inner illumination. Their liturgies focused on awakening, chanting of light within, unveiling of hidden knowledge. These rituals were stamped out because they reversed the code. Where the church used ritual to instill fear, the Gnostics used ritual to cultivate awakening. Competing liturgies could not be allowed to survive. Rituals everywhere remind us of how deep the system's script runs. To kneel at the Eucharist is to rehearse blood as currency. To chant the creed is to reaffirm the contract. To fear apocalypse is to perform obedience to empire's story. The performance is so ingrained that even unbelievers participate, fearing climate collapse, technological doom, economic ruin, in ways that mirror the same architecture. Fear is the ritual that binds, regardless of creed. But awakening begins in ritual too. To reinterpret symbols is to perform new gestures. To see the beast as empire rather than monster is to reclaim vision. To speak of apocalypse as unveiling is itself a ritual act, breaking the rhythm of fear with the rhythm of truth. To imagine the end not as destruction but as exposure is to rehearse freedom in thought and word. Every refusal to fear, every reinterpretation is a counter-ritual. The forbidden truth is this: apocalypse has always been ritual, performed endlessly to keep humanity small. But rituals can be rewritten. They do not belong to empire forever. Each unveiling, each act of reclamation, each moment of defiance is a new liturgy, one that prepares not for doom, but for awakening. And when enough awaken, the old rituals falter, the fear collapses, and the true apocalypse begins. The unveiling not of the world's destruction, but of the system's lies. Awakening to the system is like stepping out of a theater where the same play has been staged for centuries. You rub your eyes, and for the first time, realize the fire raining from the sky was painted on canvas. The trumpets were props, the beast a mask worn by empire. The apocalypse you were taught to fear was not the world's destruction, but the unveiling of the illusion itself. And once the veil falls, you cannot unsee what lies beneath. The first realization is that apocalypse has always been weaponized. The word simply means unveiling, a revelation of what was hidden. Yet the church and empire recast it into annihilation, an end drenched in fire. This was not misinterpretation, it was strategy. By teaching that unveiling meant doom, they ensured humanity would fear truth itself. If revelation is terrifying, people cling to authority. If apocalypse is destruction, the system that hides behind the veil survives unchallenged. Awakening begins when you see this inversion clearly. You were never the target of apocalypse, empire was. The second realization is that apocalypse was written for the oppressed, not the rulers. The Book of Revelation was a coded message to communities crushed by Rome. It's whispering that their suffering was not eternal, that the empire they feared would fall like Babylon before it. The beast was not a prophecy of some distant monster, it was their emperor. The seals and trumpets were not divine punishments, but rituals of unveiling, showing how empire consumes itself through conquest, war, famine, and death. Awakening is seeing that the apocalypse is not your doom but your liberation, not judgment on humanity but exposure of empire's lies. The third realization is that apocalypse lives everywhere because it is ritualized. You see it in sermons of fire, in paintings of horsemen, in films of cities collapsing. You realize that every image of apocalypse's doom is a rehearsal of obedience, a ritual designed to keep you trembling. But when you awaken, you reclaim the symbols. The cross is not submission, but resistance. The horsemen are not omens of God's wrath, but mirrors of empire's greed. The fire is not eternal punishment, but illumination, burning away the veil. Awakening flips the ritual. The same symbols that bound you become the keys that free you. This awakening is not comfortable. It strips away the false security of obedience, demands that you face the truth, that the systems which claim to protect you built their power on fear of a lie. Apocalypse as annihilation was their greatest invention, their most perfect contract, their most enduring ritual. To awaken is to see that you were never debtor, never criminal, never condemned, was empire all along, hiding behind visions of doom. And here lies the forbidden truth. Apocalypse is not the end. It is the end of the system. When the veil is torn away, when Babylon falls, when the beast is unmasked, it is not the earth that burns, it is the illusions of empire. Apocalypse is not destruction, but exposure. It is the great unveiling that reveals who has fed on blood, who has forged contracts of fear, who has inverted symbols into shackles. It is the end of lies, not the end of life. Awakening to the system means daring to embrace this truth. It means no longer fearing apocalypse, but welcoming it. For apocalypse is not fire falling from heaven. It is the fire already burning in your eyes when you see through the deception. It is not trumpets of doom, it is the sound of chains breaking when you refuse obedience. It is not beasts rising from the sit, is the recognition that every empire wears the beast's face. The apocalypse has always been here, waiting for you to see. And when you awaken, the system trembles. For its survival depends on your fear, your silence, your performance of rituals that bind. Once you stop fearing, once you see through, once you refuse to perform, the architecture collapses. The apocalypse is not the end of the world, is the end of their world. The unveiling of their fraud. That is why it has been so fiercely inverted, so endlessly ritualized, so carefully weaponized. Because the moment humanity awakens, the great unveiling begins. The apocalypse is not to be dreaded, it is to be embraced. It is not death, it is disclosure. It is not the collapse of creation, it is the collapse of illusion. To awaken to the system is to see that the apocalypse was never coming in the future. It has always been here, whispering in symbols, waiting for eyes to open. And when you awaken, you realize the end is not the end at all. It is the beginning. If apocalypse is revelation, then the end we dread is only the end of their illusion. What follows is not ruin, but awakening. In the next chapter, where we descend into forbidden lineage, the serpent crown, bloodlines of the forbidden kings. Subscribe and continue the unveiling.